Hello and welcome, everybody. It's great to see such a big crowd here. Welcome to the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering seminar this month on the art of scientific communication. My name is Sandra Kentish and I'm the chair of the Victorian division of ATSE. Let me start by acknowledging traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting. We pay our respects to them, their culture, their elders past, present and future, and elders from other communities who may be with us today. On a personal note, I'd also like to lend my support to the Voice to Parliament, which we presented at a referendum later this year. But I'm looking forward to a fascinating discussion this evening regarding the art of scientific communication. And to kick off this discussion, I'm delighted to introduce Professor the Honourable Carr, who was a Senator for Victoria for an outstanding 29 years, which is impressive, very impressive when you consider the state of play in politics. So he's from 1993 to 2022. And importantly, he was Minister for Innovation, Industry, Science and Research. Appointed in 2007, he held that cabinet post for most of Labor's previous 6 years term in government. He also served as Minister for Manufacturing, Defence, Material, Human Services and Higher Education, and he's currently a Vice-Chancellor's Professorial Fellow at Monash. So over to you, Kip.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to say a few words. Just, indicating that 29 years, the average life expectancy of a politician is 7 years. So I've lifted the average a little bit. I don't know who's actually benefited from that, but it's, I'm been asked to comment on the art of scientific communication and how do we build public support for a scientifically engaged Australia. Now, I'm making a couple of assumptions in speaking tonight. First of all, I'm assuming that you regard that communication is in itself an art. I'm also assuming that you would agree with the proposition that I put forward that good science and research communication can actually move people. And it can influence the ways of thinking and can influence action. Now, all of us here are in the business of science diplomacy, of advocacy, of education, of problem solving, and I hope of building a better society. A further assumption that I'll be making tonight, and it's one that I've held for a very long time, and that is that to define science in the German tradition. We've got philosophy professors here with us, so I've got to be a little careful here. That is, I take science to mean what makes the universe intelligible. It's a notion that science is about our knowledge of our universe. It's not just about confirming the validity of scientific knowledge. And therefore, it includes engineering. It includes the humanities, it includes social science. So with a relatively new government, it's 1 year today for most of the ministers were sworn in Canberra, there are opportunities that are being opened. The timing is right for the development of what I suggest is a scientific compact with the government. It actually be a principle that was actually put into the Labor platform by myself some years ago. It's not there anymore. The government's public statements on climate change, on engineering, on manufacturing, on critical technology, on so many things, on quantum computing, on cybersecurity, suggest the door is actually open, at least a little wider, to the scientific and research community than it was in previous years. The emphasis on research and development equally highlights the role of business. And central to that long-term support is the $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund. However, Minister Husic has also made it clear, and I quote him here, the government could not be expected to do all the heavy lifting. So with fiscal consolidation, use the term that the order of the day, from governments at all levels, it is important that science advocates are able to emphasise the value in giving science a priority over other matters vying for investment and support. And the response from the learned academies to a recent budget indicates that there is disquiet within the science and research communities. The science community can offer Parliament, not just the government, but Parliament, a rare partnership, and I want to emphasise this, in defence of democracy. You bring to the partnership your expertise and authority, which the country needs now more than ever. And if we look to the future, we need to ask ourselves what we do as a country. What sort of country do we want to actually be? And we said about rebuilding national aspiration, about rebuilding the economy. We first have to concentrate on rebuilding trust. Now, there is something that both sides of any partnership need to focus on as a matter of priority. Trust not just between the partners themselves, but public trust. Public trust in institutions and in their personnel, and through research, through the expertise, through the evidence-based advice and leadership, you can formulate and enact policy. I trust that everyone here is in fact aware that public trust in public authority has declined. And that won't change simply because you've got to change your government. Now, this is not just a case in this country, it's across the world. And that's the finding of several researchers and analysts. Trust in government, both and of course in the media, has fallen significantly. Both are increasingly seen as divisive and as touters of misinformation and as being incapable of solving problems. Now, that's the situation you find in surveys like Alderman, which was reinforced in their findings this year. Not last year, not before the election, but after the election. Cost of living pressures, housing affordability issues, growing political polarisation are seen as a breakdown in social solidarity. And can I remind you that ASIO asserts that it is spending 50% of its time on right-wing extremist groups. So in this environment, we need all the communication skills, all the tools that we have at our disposal to speak and to write persuasively to people of all walks of life. We need more than just a strong and robust message. We need strategies and convictions to have science and engineering messages heard and understood. And while trust in scientists has declined, it's down about 6% in the last survey results that I've seen, scientists are among the most trusted of all the professional groups. Trust is vital to the building of social licence and to our system of government. Social licence is essential to public trust. It's a circular argument. Telling people what is good for them, for their society, or the planet does not in itself win an argument or unquestioning support, regardless of how strong the evidence base might be for such a proposition. And if I draw your attention to, say, what Malcolm Turnbull used to do, his ideas boom, it's a case in point. The word innovation was used in every sentence. Catherine Livingstone at the time made it clear, without context. It was presented with an emphasis on disruption. And instead, many people heard this as job destruction. So today, headlines that claim AI will lead to humanity's extinction do not reassure. That's financial review as of today. The National Science and Technology Council's AI report and the release of today of the discussion paper on AI regulation recognises the importance of this technology. But today the anxiety does exist, and it remains. ATSE's Australian Digital Consumer Study of 23 reports that Australian workers do not accept the assurance of the tech industry that jobs will improve. 70% of workers are expecting jobs to be replaced in 10 years. But this is not the first time we've seen, well, this generation has had to deal with the broader issue of morality, ethics, and the uses of technology. It's nonetheless important to focus. Those of us who have been working in science and research and in politics and public services have to have very firm objectives. We need to aim to provide solutions that actually recognise the real world, that restore faith in communities' ability to build. We have to be able to argue, well, that our system can work for ordinary people, not just for the elites. We have to be able to argue that we can lift living standards and social well-being by contributing to technological and material progress. And so with so much of the news cycle was dominated, particularly with social media, consumed by knee-jerk reaction, is all the more pressing that the Academy should authoritatively demonstrate that long-term solutions are not only necessary, but are workable. We should be confident that research and its translation that we champion can foster social cohesion, improve the natural environment, increase the psychological well-being, and encourage tolerance, and as I say, advance democracy. In this way, the Academy can work creatively and effectively to counter disinformation. Good information, I repeat, presented clearly, concisely, and persuasively remains critical to good decisions. Now, experience has taught me that the Academy has the potential to be much more effective in influencing policy and public opinion than it currently is. To help reach this potential, it must be agile, be aware of how politics works and how popular opinion is formed. I start with a simple proposition. Ministers are time poor. They are constantly required to deal with a number of critical and complex issues and concurrently, both within their own portfolios and beyond. So the Academy needs to communicate that is finely honed. There needs to be a lot, because there is such an enormous competition for political attention. Information needs to be both precise and concise. The Academy has a vital role to play in strengthening the quality of information, not just in the Parliament, but in the public, which of course the Parliament seeks to serve. You need to know your audience and write for it. Some practical suggestions may well be of use here. I want to highlight not just the importance of a specific program, but the links it has to the broader government programs and the policy objectives. It's often helpful to identify costings, the employment implications, and even suggest the electoral implications. Equally important is remembering that it's not just ministers that make decisions, but members of Parliament more broadly, including you must identify political allies outside of the Cabinet. I can't emphasise enough the importance of engagement with the public service, who, of course, are the ones that brief ministers, who prepare policy options, and who evaluate the effectiveness of programs. Departments will be preparing briefs for the very meetings that you have established. They play a critical role in shaping the response. And I suggest to you, you shouldn't be frightened of repetition. politicians know that when they are biliously tired of saying something, that is when some people are just beginning to hear the message. Now, this country faces acute challenges across a range of areas: the economy, energy systems, our environment, and many social issues. The stakes couldn't be higher. Our R&D as a percentage of GDP is miles below our competitors, and our performance in recent years has been declining. Now, the Labor Party's stated policy aim is to lift R&D from 1.8% of GDP to 3% by 2030. I say stated aim, it's not actually in the draft platform that's going to the next national conference. They've taken it out. Now, I think that's an appropriate ambition. It's much more difficult than we appreciate that Australia's business culture lags behind our competitors. The average ASX 200 company spend about 3% of revenue on R&D, compared to the international average of 6% for listed companies. Further, figures from the industry department assert that only a minority of Australian companies are actually innovative active. Even a resource-rich country needs the talents and skills of all its citizens to build a confident, economically and culturally, socially just society. We need to be a country that is in fact a formidable global citizen, a country that is in fact secure and resilient. So when I look at the Economic Complexity Index, I see that as an indicator of the resilience of an economy. And what I find there is that while Australia is the 9th richest country of the 33 countries that are actually surveyed by Harvard, we are the 91st country in terms of economic complexity. Now, 20 years ago, we were 57th. We are behind Namibia, Kenya, Uganda, and Senegal. The deterioration has accelerated. We now have less economic complexity than we did 10 years ago, given the destruction of our automotive industry. Surely our economic performance is simply not good enough. The fact is that Australia, our national innovation system, lacks cohesion, it lacks coordination, it lacks program scale of other advanced industrial economies. Our research effort is fragmented across some 200 plus programs in 13 portfolios. The business support programs aimed at stimulating investment number some 550. You hear all too often that business finds the programs to be completely impenetrable. Our single largest instrument for R&D support is the tax incentive. And it's not been touched by any of the reviews that are running within the education system. Basic research funding has now slipped to 22% of total funding. And I maintain the view that without new knowledge, there is no commercialisation. Now, here's a suggestion for a political campaign on achieving the percentage of GDP that the target that the government has previously stated is its position. The current situation, as frankly, is, as the Academy of Science said about the recent budget, lamentable. The most recent science tables show that the government's expenditure on R&D as a percentage of GDP are at the lowest level since records began. Further, during the pandemic, education spending actually fell. So it's time that we had a whole of government root and branch review that could lift our R&D performance. Such a review, in fact, probably a better term, national inquiry, needs to build upon the best international experience that we've seen with the British, with their nurse review, with the Canadians with their basic science review, or with the Americans with their National Academies review, which all we fondly remember as rising above the gathering storm. Historically, we have used the review process to shape national policy directions. I think of the Vernon Inquiry, 1965. I think of the Jackson Inquiry into manufacturing in 1974. Such a review into our national innovation system would be timely, but will require the support of the leading players within that system. And so I just leave you with this thought. Why does scientific engagement matter? Played well, the science and research community has a big role to play politically, because our living standards, our social well-being depend upon the productivity of our economy and the capacity to solve problems and build things. Our national aspiration has to be a country that is more than just a beach or a quarry. And with a collective effort, we can be technologically advanced, prosperous, a social democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim, for an extremely thought-provoking and in some ways depressing, but otherwise inspiring presentation. And I'm sure many of you will have questions for Kim, but we're going to now have a bit of a discussion panel. So I'm going to invite up to the chairs at the front here, two other panelists. So firstly, Professor Susan Dodds, who's the Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor and Vice President for Research and Industry Engagement at La Trobe University. She's also a Professor of Philosophy and is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. And importantly, in the context of this discussion, she was recently appointed to the ARC's Advisory Council by Jason Clare and has been part of a recent review panel of the ARC Act. I'm also delighted, feel free to step up, Susan. It's a bit like, you know, with World Supermodel or something here. But also welcome Professor Bronwyn Fox, who's Chief Scientist of CSIRO, Australia's National Science Agency and Innovation Catalyst. She's known globally as a leader in advanced manufacturing, materials science and Industry 4.0 technology. So welcome, Bronwyn. And Kim, if you can also join us up here. And if I can encourage those of you on Zoom, you are welcome to post questions through the Q&A part of the Zoom chat. And we have a microphone here for you guys to share. But let me start. Kim, you gave a fascinating overview of the need to engage both the public, the corporate world, government, ministers, the public service, a whole range of people. And I thought I'd start by asking both Susan and Bronwyn to comment on, particularly, let's start with the first one. How do we best engage with the public in this domain?
Great, thank you, Sandra. I think that engaging with the public, you need to understand what the public is concerned about, listen to it, engage with it, and then look for ways forward. I think that coming through and saying, I've got really fascinating research, aren't you thrilled by it, works really well if you're asked to do, say, a school visit and you want to inspire people in what you do. But if you're actually trying to talk to people about what public policy should be, you need to understand the problems that are concerned to them and engage with them at that level, but also be sufficiently circumspect in your knowledge so that you don't assume that you know what's good. And I think that one of the comments of saying, you know, I'm the expert, listen to me and I'll solve your problems is never successful, but rather saying, there's a lot of work going on in this area. These are some of the things that we're seeing at the moment. These are the reasons we need to look further into it in order to find solutions. That's how I would tend to think about engaging with publics, is to find a problem that people are trying to find an answer to first and work from there.
Oh, thank you. And Kim, I noted your point, and it's quite disappointing to learn that the public trust in scientists has decreased by 6%. However, I think there's something else going on at the same time. And it wasn't that long ago that we were surrounded by fake news and alternative facts, and then COVID hit. And then all of a sudden we wanted facts and we wanted the evidence and we wanted that delivered by scientists. So I've never seen scientists get such cut through in the media as we have now. And that then poses a challenge to us. What do we do with that? How do we make the most of that moment in the sun? And how do we rally as a community to make sure that we're focused on what's important rather than just us all going individually to promote our own particular field or cause? And then most importantly, how do we inspire that next generation to study science, to take up, a scientific endeavour, to take, soil samples from their local community and analyse them, to, start experimenting with robotics. I think that's going to be so important for us in the future and is something we need to think about. The other thing that has happened is I think that scientists value communication more than we have in the past. And I've noticed a bit of a backlash in my career, early in my career, not so much recently, against people who were great scientific communicators. They were almost belittled. They were told that they weren't going deep enough. But it's really important that we don't confuse something being explained really well with something being dumbed down. They are two very different things. And it's wonderful to see the value of science communication increase in society. And my most recent, prior to joining CSIRO, I was at Swinburne University, and there was a professor with a 50% dedicated role to science communication. And, if there's anything we can do, we need more Alan Duffys, and we need everyone to play a role in promoting science and just really articulating the excitement of doing science.
Thank you, Bronwyn. And Kim, you talked a lot about the fact that the tax incentive is the biggest consumer of research dollars, and the corporates still don't do a relatively small component of their budget goes to research. How do we change the dial on that? How do we engage with the corporates? I know in my own discipline that the research labs that used to exist for BHP and companies like that no longer exist. How do we reinvigorate the corporate world and get them on board in this, in addition to the government players?
Well, I think we've seen the decline with public enterprise. Privatisation has meant that Telstra Labs, for instance, and Gas and Fuel Corporation, a whole series of public entities used to run very substantial programs, well, not only very significant in the training of apprentices, but also of scientists and the engagement in R&D. The reality is that our bird performance is pretty ordinary. What are we going to do about that? It strikes me that there have been a number of points of analysis that are still pertinent. I've been a supporter of changing the tax incentive to provide support for what I call a collaboration premium. I actually proposed that in the election of 2019. And I based the material on long experience. That is the quickest way to change the culture in terms of the way people react to the learned academies, to the universities, to the science agencies, was to give people skin in the game. We've all heard the argument, don't you, that universities are pretty ordinary places to actually do business with. They're too slow, they're unresponsive, and they don't understand business. On the other hand, you've heard the argument that says, well, hang on a minute, too many of our companies want to do R&D on the cheap and think that the academy, the academics are in fact to be used as some sort of second-rate research officers for the company. So my argument is that if you were to change the R&D tax incentive and provide a financial incentive, you will change the culture very, very quickly. The science agencies, the universities would understand there is some purpose, and the companies would also see the value much more quickly. So that's a very practical suggestion as to how we could change the culture. Now, at the end of the day, it will require political imperative to be pursued to see the value in that approach. The R&D tax incentive is the single largest instrument we have available within the toolbox of R&D policy in this country. In my time, we undertook a major restructuring of it to actually build support, particularly for non-profitable companies, so they could get some advantages out of the tax system. Whatever changes we proposed through the industry department was vigorously opposed by the Treasury, who saw this as a drain on the budget, not about changing the culture of the place, but as a major problem in itself. So there's always going to be that dichotomy, and that's why I'm suggesting there needs to be a political drive to lift that target into the reality of conversations within all our spheres of activity.
Thanks, Kim. And Susan, Kim's talked a lot about this need for an integrated research ecosystem that's properly funded, but we're developing the Australian Universities Accord, and you're involved in the ARC review. How does that fit with some of the statements that Kim's talking about? Are we already doing this through those processes?
Thanks. I think the Australian Universities Accord is probably the piece that's doing some of it, but it's doing it as a Department of Education piece with a little bit of lifting its horizons to look across whole of government. I mean, one of the things I would say to Kim is one of the things that Australian researchers currently do is they do research for a lot of government agencies, but they're not funded to do that research. The Department of Education is paying, and international students' fees are paying for the research time for people to provide that kind of expertise and support. That's a function of losing the battle with the Department of Finance. but I think that there's that the challenge, and part of I think what would be Kim's push would need to be one that says something like the Universities Accord, which is looking at what's the funding for both the educational research and social purpose of universities in order to address things like, access to higher education in regions, or trying to ensure that we've got the skills base for a modern economy, that it needs to also look at a whole of government approach to the role of universities in supporting that democratic purpose. I share with Kim that kind of Deweyan idea that, in a modern democracy, you need to have some respect for expertise and draw on expertise, but that needs to be earned through providing clear reasoning for why particular expert advice should be followed. And making that work is a whole of government approach. It can't be just a fragment. The ARC Act review was very much more focused on how do we protect the fundamental and basic research capability within Australia? How do we ensure that the strength of the ARC so that it can be justifiably funded by government to provide that basis for research that will then be the translated, implemented, commercialized, whatever it may be, research. As I agree again that you can't commercialize research if it hasn't any sound basis, and we don't want to find ourselves really just finding new products and consumers for additional add-ons rather than the fundamental piece. But I think that real piece around the lifting of research capability needs to be seen in part as the role of research in a stable democracy, and the role of research in supporting all of government approaches. I mean, the biggest health provider in the country is the federal government. Maybe it needs some good advice on what would be, appropriate use of resources. So I think that's a bigger challenge.
And Bronwyn, can you talk, do you know of any international exemplars in this space? How is it done better internationally?
Well, it's done differently, and I think we can learn from what's happening internationally. But the first thing I'd like to say is that universities, businesses, CSIRO, even politics have something in common in that they're all populated by human beings. And it's those relationships between human beings and that trusted information sharing that really makes a difference in shared challenges, co-designing projects, and developing, solutions together. So it's so important that we don't forget that. I've worked extensively in Germany, and it's been a fantastic privilege. One of the most impressive models I've seen is at the University of Stuttgart. There they have a industry on campus model for doing research. It's called ARENA 2036. The foundation partner was Mercedes. So ARENA stands for Active Research Environment for Next Generation Automobiles. And Germans like acronyms. And 2036 is the 150th birthday of the automobile, if you happen to work for Mercedes-Benz. You'll see that other companies may have other views. So it is just amazing. It's a 10,000 square metre flexible factory floor with office space around it. You walk in there, there's a startup ecosystem with a startup competition. There's robotics, automation, digitalisation, they're incubating startups. You are bumping into people and walking into meetings, and you don't know whether the person you're talking to works for Mercedes, Bosch, Siemens, the university, for the Fraunhofer. It's just seamless, and it's an incredible ecosystem. And as a result, they've spun out a number of really impressive technologies. They've also partnered with us in Australia. They see Australians as having something really unique to offer. We take risks, calculated risks, we're very creative. And when we work with German research organisations who are very deep, they go very deep, it's a fantastic combination. We get the best of both worlds. So we've had collaborative projects on creating a digital twin with Germany. There's a new call for projects that's just been announced on quantum technologies. I think, there's a lot we can learn from the model and a lot we could translate to Australia, but also a lot we can learn from working globally and just exposing ourselves to those larger markets and helping Australian startups and scale-ups to access those larger companies and access those larger markets.
Thanks, Bronwyn. I have more questions. I thought I'd pause here and see if we have any questions from the audience, and I can sneak over and see whether we have any on Zoom. We will ask the mic then.
Thanks, Sally McCarthy from Deakin. I think one of the interesting questions is when we go out and do this SciComm, and this is a commentary I think we've heard from a lot of the people who ended up on television from universities during COVID, is the pushback and the violence and the threat that came with that. And how do we tackle the personal sense of this, that you're putting yourself on the line, you're putting your family on the line, your reputation, and how do we change that culture around some of this? Can we change that culture? Is that just a fact of life now? And we have to be better as employers and helping support people.
Who wants to take this?
I can see this one coming. Look, I agree with you that we've seen some really appalling responses to people who we have asked, as being on virtue of their expertise, to come forward and explain complex matters to others, and then seeing them be basically magnets for attack. So I think that as institutions, whether it's a university, another research organization, a government, we need to stand up and say that's not acceptable. We need to put in steps that protect people. We need to also help train people so they can know about it. I mean, I've worked for many years in 2 universities where there have been people who've been starting with HIV, doing research with stigmatized communities. And then every time we put out a report, and Victoria is a fantastic place for doing this, you get very, very negative responses. So we have an obligation, if we're asking people to do this research, we're supporting them, that we should support them also so that they're protected from that. But we also, as a community, need to call it out, because the easiest way to create an environment where that gets continued is to say, okay, respectful debate's one thing, calling out my reasoning is okay, but attacking the individual on the basis of not liking the message, that's not acceptable. And but we need to do a lot of work. Our media do not help us. We need to do a lot of work in creating an environment where people can safely have those robust discussions, and we're not just setting people up. I mean, we've seen it around the world through COVID. We've seen it on a number of cases, but it's getting worse, and it's getting worse Partly because it's politically effective.
Anybody else like to comment on that?
Well, can I just add, this to me is a reflection of the decline in public trust. Now, it's not just for those that were talking about responses to the pandemic. The level of support for science did increase, but then declined quite significantly as people became disenchanted with the responses, to the point where governments were quite openly saying we're no longer following scientific advice. You know, we've got political imperatives. But it's not just in the medical field. Professor Eddie Holmes at Sydney University, New South Wales Scientist of the Year by a Liberal government, and mighty National Scientist of the Year as well, was vilified on the front pages of the Australian newspaper because he worked on the virus issues at a Wuhan. His team was subject to death threats, rape threats, any number of quite, I think, disgusting responses generated by those that saw this as a legitimate form of political expression. I mentioned ASIOs and 50% of their work now is with extreme groups. We're seeing the importation of American political culture here as a response to people being disengaged, alienated from the political system. And it takes more than just call it out. I can say this to you, the level of violence directed at politicians, for instance, in my time increased quite dramatically. But there is another aspect to it, and that is, as you've mentioned, it's part of the engagement. You do have to, I mean, I was more and more worried about my family. I personally didn't have too much, I mean, I always thought this was an amazing country. You know, I could go down to many pawn shops and be treated really quite well. Whereas others said, listen, we cannot go out in public without being abused. I think people are generally, I mean, the positive side of Australian life is that you don't have to wander around as a politician with security guards. You know, so emphasising the positives also worthwhile, but being aware that there are political groups now that feel, and you see the local government, for instance, in recent times, these are highly organised agitators, you know, importing the ideas from the United States and exercising a form of fascism that should be confronted in an organised way by the state.
It's a very, very fraught issue. Snow, did you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kim. Always sort of provoking, but you know, this is a very opportune time to make those comments because we need to do something. The question is, though, where do you start? And I was quite attracted to your practical suggestion because we know over long experience that when people actually work together, and you've got to grease that, there's friendships, networks are formed, which last for a very long time. So I like your suggestion, but and which you know very well, this exam. I was very much part of it, which occurred in the Hawke government, in the rural industries, when a very sort of visionary person, John Carr, established the Rural Industry R&D Corporation, which the fundamentals of that model were 0.5% from the industry, 0.5% from government. And of course, we had to defend that for the first 20 years against bloody treasury. But it's been done. And now we have industries that have actually upped their percentage. Some industries now put in 1% because they see that, and they see a research pie that's grown from about 100 million to more than 500 million in those 30 years. So I think we need, and the academies need, have succinct ways of getting an idea. It may not be the perfect idea. If we wait for the perfect idea, it's not going to happen. I think we've got to coalesce around an idea and just push it, and push it very strongly in a coordinated way. And as you say, when you get sick of saying it, you say it some more, because every time you say it, about 20% of the audience might get it. So I think we need a few succinct ideas that are always lovely things that are nice to have. But if we want to make a step on that road to being a better society, I think we need a couple of good ideas. They're not revolutionary ideas, but they're ideas which we all support and we drive them through. I'm sorry that was more of a comment, but it's a question.
Well, if you think about the lasting impact, if you think about the things that have actually stood the test of time, the R&D corporations are one, and Karen was remarkable in that. I put into the CSIRO board, you know. The fact is that we do much more work in agriculture than we do in many other fields.
Yeah.
Medical science does exceedingly well because it's socially well connected. Right? It's the big end of town, very much. Now, in the rural areas, the R&D has been most effective, again, socially well connected. You think about the CRC program, the Cream first introduced, I think, was the earlier pioneer in that, in the Hawke government. Look, I'm suggesting something quite simple. The target of 3% of GDP by 2030 is something that everyone can get hold of. But you'll have huge opposition to it. And so you've got to find new arguments. It's about productivity. It's about economic prosperity. It's about modernisation. And I'm suggesting a national inquiry because something that it's a rallying point. But to be successful, all the major groups have to stand behind it. Because otherwise, what will be said in Canberra, remember, I put this up first in 2014. It was the first time we did the 3% target, was in 2014 in Shorten's address and reply to the budget. If I went through a complicated process, it never would have been acknowledged. Because the first question is, how are you going to fund it? How are we going to fund moving from 1.8 to 3%? That's why I say the national inquiry idea is the mechanism. We'll have a look at that. No, I don't try to write a report now, but that's not the point. It's about the political mobilisation. And so you need coordination. I'm saying the academies need to be politicised. I don't mean party political. I'm talking about publicly engaged. And they need to speak more effectively than they do. Now, this academy came out after the last budget and talked about the crisis in research. The Science Academy used some pretty strong language. Universities Australia took forever. And, you know, we might well say, oh, well, we're leaving it to the compact to sort out. That's bullshit. The compact will produce the lowest common denominator. And it'll be resolved that the universities that aren't research intensive will say we need money for equity, not excellence. And that the money going to the group of 8 is about promoting privilege. See, these are the inherent contradictions that are going to emerge. I can tell you now, that's what's happening right now. And it will not look at the issue about the overall state of our innovation system. It will look at one slither. The ARC review could only do what it was required to do, look at one agency. The science priorities run by, former CSIRO chief scientists, I don't think will produce an economy-wide response. And if you want to lock in the political support, you've got to go much broader than just an institutional foundation.
Thanks, Kim. It's powerful words, and I think there's certainly a lot there for us to think about. I've got one question online. I can see there's lots of questions here. This is a question from Mark Barry, and Susan, this might go to you first. Thinking back to the 2008 review of our national innovation system, the Prime Minister's closing remarks included the statement, "This false divide between the arts and science, between the arts and industry, between the arts and the economy, we've actually got to put that to bed." So has this been put to bed during the 15 years since the review, or is STEM still missing the elusive A?
Fighting words. Well, I think that we haven't been assisted by some of our government colleagues over that period when there has been in recent years a desire to diminish recognition of the value of the humanities, recognition of the value of the conceptual social sciences. I think there's been an attempt to make a deeper wedge within sort of the political discourse around what should be funded, what's valuable. However, I think that in practice, I see lots of really fantastic examples. I mean, in attempting to regularly go back to the question of how do we address climate change, there are more and more creative and conceptual discussions going on that move beyond the here's the data we're all going to burn, but moves to questions about, well, what are the social practices we need to shift? What are the social understandings we need to support? How can we conceptualize what a world will be like if we have either a major shift in the base for the economy or are facing significant climatic disaster? I think that there's much more connection between science and art. There's much more connection between science and society than was the case in the past decade. But I think that it's also the case as an ongoing project. That if we keep on having a view that says that the social sciences and humanities can be the handmaids to science and can really support the way the community can understand, well, one, we've forgotten the fact that there's lots of really brilliant science communicators who are much better at it than there are my colleagues in the humanities and social sciences in conveying the importance of the science. So don't bring us in at the end. But there are also a range of social practices and issues and concerns that can't be simply tacked on at the end. They need to be thought through all the way. And so I think this is an ongoing, it's a work in progress, but I think there are real signs in practice. In my experience, young researchers get it. Young researchers are asking the questions right from the beginning, not asking, so Sue, can you come along and help identify what the ethical issues are in this thing I'm already done with? They're actually asking, I want to do this thing, how do we do it well? How do we avoid certain kinds of issues? So I think that there is a shift going on. Bronwyn, you might have more to say on this.
I believe you're right, that there is a shift, and I've witnessed it in a number of different instances, most recently in a partnership between CSIRO and Swinburne University of Technology around hydrogen. And there was a lot of work designed into that program initially on understanding social resistance to new energy forms, on ensuring that there was social license for the implementation and use of hydrogen. And that's just one example, but most importantly, that was deliberately designed into the program of work from the very beginning, which is the shift that I've seen, and we need much more of it. It is challenging to find enough social scientists to support all of these initiatives and the breadth of work, but if we keep valuing their contribution, we'll have more come through the pipeline.
And I think we had about 5 hands go up in the audience here, and we're running short of time. I'm going to go with Tom first.
Tom Sterling from Swinburne. Thank you very much, Kim, for your talk and the panel for the discussion. Kim, you mentioned that it's important to when you communicate with government to communicate with the bureaucracy. Can you comment on how more difficult? Seems to me this has become a bit more difficult since the public services have typically become a bit de-skilled in some of the areas of expertise. So the mines department, in the old days, knew a lot about the mining industry. Maybe how difficult is that, and how should the academies approach that sort of communication?
We clearly need to get a second microphone. Who's going here?
Well, I maintain the view that it has been wrong to privatise the expert advice. I often tell the story about what's the difference between a consultant and a shopping trolley. It's possible you can put more wine and drink into the shopping trolley than you can the consultant. But of course, the shopping trolley has a mind of its own. And that's been the difficulty with our consultants industry, that they'll tell you what you want to hear. And they often employed at much higher rates than the public service that they replaced. In fact, they were the public servants that they replaced. But having said all of that, my experience of the public service is a very positive one. And I found that if you encouraged creativity, you encouraged people to actually participate, they were only too willing to do so. I, for instance, always insisted that we had officials with us at meetings. Saved a lot of time. I didn't have to ring up a lot of people and lose the messages that went down the line. I also had the habit of ringing people directly. I get a brief up and I find the person on the bottom, which would frighten the living daylights out of the senior officials. Right? But invariably, I found public servants were extremely responsive. So it is about building that confidence and that trust. And our graduate program, for instance, my son's just joined the public service. I can say to you, I've seen it firsthand, how valuable it is. And so I'm thinking that with the political leadership, we can re-establish the authority, credibility, and capability that we need. Now, the really big advantage from a politician's point of view is to have people on tap that you can engage with. And they'll often tell you things, so long as you don't get them in writing, that's much more direct than you would if it's a note to file, you know, bearing in mind everything you say is probably written down as a note to file by some bugger, which will come up as an FOI at some point. But so it is a question of rebuilding confidence and trust.
Thanks, Kim. I could use it. And we'll time for one more question and then we'll let the panel give closing remarks. So Tony's, sorry. Paul.
Thanks very much for the panel. We're talking about communication. So I'm interested to hear from the panel, what's your favourite science communication success story?
I'm really going to give away my age here, but growing up watching TV in the 1980s, I just loved Carl Sagan, and I'll never forget the episode where he described Einstein's theory of relativity with people travelling in trains. To me, it was such a simple and effective piece of communication, and there was something about him that was just so, it just drew you in and you wanted to hear more, and he was a wonderful storyteller, which is something that's really important. We should be communicating science by telling stories.
There's so many really nice examples, and there's a lot. One of the recent features of social media are all the people doing really short clips in which they're saying, okay, here's a fascinating thing. For me, it tends to be critters, just because they are fascinating, whether they're underwater or above. But just where someone thinks in a very short period of time of saying, okay, what is it? Why is it exciting? But also, why is it important? So very often for me, it'll be the people who say, fantastic, beautiful bird. Here's the nesting site. Here's why it's under threat. This is how many there are left. This is what we can do. And it's that kind of example that it is a telling a story, but it's telling a story in a really quick, sharp way that gets across the point. The orange belly parrot is going to disappear. What are we going to do?
Well, one of my favourites was the work that Professor Brian Boyle used to do for CSIRO and for the SKA. He was a very, very effective communicator, and I got treated very badly by the CSIRO. But that's a really big success story, the SKA, in terms of tapping into what is an enormous level of public engagement around astronomy.
Thanks, Kim. And in the interest of time, I'm going to now give each of the panellists a chance to give some closing remarks. The question I originally had here was, Kim's given us a lot of challenges he's presented to us. How do we succeed in changing the game? How do we make ourselves more accessible to the public, to the government, to industry? But feel free to take that any way you like. I'll start with Bronwyn so we can finish with Kim.
It's really important that we value science communication and that we celebrate science communicators. And it's really important that we don't lose the art of storytelling. They're my two things.
I think that being prepared to answer the phone or the email or whatever communication you get, and to know that the first time you probably won't quite get the message across, but to be willing and able to say, come back to me if you need more, or to offer to articulate it in a different way. That question about, repetition is really important, but also recognizing we've got two kinds of arguments here. One is, how do we get people excited about the science at the, this piece and that piece, but also how do we get people to recognize the science system, that whole support for research really needs another level of discussion about what kind of society we want to be in.
I'd urge you to think politically. Laswell, of course, described politics as the who gets what, when and how. And I think it's really important for the academies to understand how policy's formed, what moves people, and how the public can be engaged in a country like this.
Thank you, Kim, and I really appreciate the input from all of our speakers tonight. I think it's been a fascinating session and really thought-provoking, and I think there's a lot of arguments here about what more things that the Academy, ATSE can do in this space and how we can get involved. But can I get you to give all of our speakers a round of applause for a really interesting presentation? Really appreciate their input. Just looking forward, there is no seminar in July. We decided it's all too cold and wet in the middle of winter. And we will be back in August with a presentation by some of our new fellows. So thank you very much. And those of you who are joining us for dinner, I think we're going to the back here tonight. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.